When I began thinking about this talk and given the general theme of Wales and the world, I was certainly aware over the last 25 years how my work in Wales has helped me to look at other places that I've been fortunate enough to be invited to photograph and have exhibitions and so on. But I think what I'd forgotten, and it was only when I began to look back at some of my earlier images, what I'd forgotten was how much I was influenced in the early days of my photography. You know, I am talking 50 years ago. You know I know I don't look it, but I really am. I mean, I began photographing at 11, and you know, which was more than 50 years ago. So my influences had to come from somewhere in those early days, and in those days as well, we forget that there were very few exhibitions of photography, very few books around. So in a sense, I'm pleased to be able to give this talk, because it's enabled me to reflect on how international photography, how photography from other parts of the world inspired me when I was a kid that knew in reality very little about photography. I've never been educated in photography. The MA and the PhD came somehow by default along the way, but certainly I had no previous education in photography, so I had to learn from somewhere, and where I learned from were from photographers from other places, and that in turn influenced my work. And it also allowed me, in a sense, looking at those photographs, as we've just heard, looking at those photographs of other places, those maybe what in other places might be considered prosaic, to me were romantic, to me were kind of interesting. Because they did show other places. They showed the ordinary things, and I'm going to deal a lot with that in the course of this talk, about how the ordinary things can be made extraordinary by the very act of photographing, and particularly if you photograph in a certain way. I mean, who would have thought that a 13-year-old boy, I know, I've changed, I know. A precocious 13-year-old boy would have the temerity to photograph gendarmes in Paris. I suppose they're just policemen. I mean, they are just policemen. But to a 13-year-old lad who'd never been abroad before, coming from Splot, we didn't see many policemen in Splot. We certainly didn't see gendarmes. So this was, although this was a very prosaic view of Paris, a very ordinary view of Paris, to me as a shy 13-year-old lad, it was exciting, and I was determined to capture this. And so you could almost say that some of my very first excitements, real excitements in photography, came from viewing the ordinary in places that were new to me. I didn't really have any points of reference. I was only 13, I had no education in photography, we certainly didn't do photography in school. So I had no points of reference. My parents, however, did take picture post. I mean, I think it's really interesting. These are two random, can labour recover? So, the things, yeah, and how about those, yes, yeah. That's very useful in Splot, yes. So my points of reference were again, and the great beauty about picture post is it showed, ordinary things in an extraordinary way. It had this fantastic tradition of revealing the ordinary through the medium of photography, and as we know, it also employed some of the great documentary photographers at the time. And this was just a magazine that was about in the home, and so I suppose at that time I was absorbing picture post and absorbing the imagery that came through there, and it just revealed ordinary things. These are, I mean, there was nothing extraordinary about Picture Post in terms of its subject matter. It was the way, as far as I was concerned, it was the way that that subject matter was revealed by great photography that made you really interested in the world around you and made you observe. And when you see a great photograph of something quite prosaic, you look at it again. You know, a good photograph can make somebody look at that thing again in a different way. And that's a theme that I'm going to be coming back to. And it was the sometimes quirky photographs that you saw, which to me as a kid, okay, we can laugh at them now and think they're fairly lightweight, possibly. But to me as a kid, they excited me because again, they revealed something extraordinary about the ordinary. And also as a kid, I did spend a lot of time in the National Museum in Cardiff. It was free. While my contemporaries in school were knocking around playing football or rugby from Splot Park on a Saturday morning, I was the odd one who went to the National Museum and absorbed, you know, for me, some of the great paintings of the world. We're so lucky in Cardiff to have those, and I was absorbed by the landscape, and I used to spend a lot of my Saturday mornings wandering around looking at these landscapes, and it may well be that these pictures also kind of stuck in my memory. I also remember after that Paris photograph was taken the following year, the teachers took us to Amsterdam, and I remember one of the teachers took us to the Rijksmuseum, and he said to me, "Davis, you're the one who likes a bit of art." And he grabbed me by the shirt collar and he frog-marched me down a corridor, and he stood me in front of Rembrandt's Night Watch and said, "Get a load of that, Davis." And you know, again, I remember being incredibly moved by this incredible, physically big painting. But to me, at the time, it looked like a documentary photograph. There was so much going on in it. It was a snapshot of time. And these are very important memories for me. And these are memories of other places being imposed on me. And so it was with the National Museum. Thomas Jones, this was an extraordinary painting. It was so simple. It seemed to almost be photographic. It was, Thomas Jones. And the important thing here is, of course, we talk about Welsh artists. A Welsh artist goes to Naples. He was a student of Richard Wilson. And came back with these very ordinary views of Naples. Just a prosaic wall, a bit of sky, a few trees, some washing hanging from the line. Certainly not the subject matter of most classical landscape painters of 1782. And something that was recognized, of course, by Peter Galassi, who used Thomas Jones's work in one of his important books, Before Photography. And here is somebody using the medium of painting, but trying to paint the ordinary to make us look at to reveal it in an extraordinary way. Stripping away all of that kind of artifice of the classical painting tradition and just celebrating the everyday. And that's something else that impressed me. It's the very ordinariness of things, I think, that almost demands closer scrutiny. You wonder why somebody has photographed or painted, a wall like that, and there's just 3 items of clothing hanging out of the window. But it tells us so much, I think, about the culture of the country. It tells us so much about the people who inhabit that space. It tells us so much, we can read so much into that. And because it's painted in this simple yet exquisite way, and because the subject matter is so prosaic, you almost demand that you look at it in a way and you scrutinize every detail far more, I think, than some of the grander classical paintings.